Hello, everybody. In this lecture, we are going to talk about viral infections of animals. So let's get right into it. So by the end of this module, you should be able to identify the key mechanisms by which viruses can cause chronic or latent persistent infections and explain what makes a virus oncogenic and name examples of oncogenic viruses and the cancers they may cause. So we've got three types of infections that we want to talk about here. One, we've got acute infections. These are non-persistent. This is where the virus infects the host and immediately begins making new virions and um, usually resulting in a decent amount of cell death. Then we have chronic persistent infections and latent persistent infections. So in general, a persistent infection is where virus replication strategies are going to allow them to avoid the immune system. And so they don't immediately start making your virions and necessarily. So with our acute infections, virus replication is going to begin immediately. This is very similar to your lytic phages, right? So they're going to start likely lysine cells right away. And this could also result in something like influenza. So you can have enveloped viruses do this as well and just continuously budding without lysis, but ultimately they completely take over the cells. Now, chronic persistent infections are a little bit different. This really results in a chronic release of virions. And so it's characterized by a slow progression of disease. And many of the chronic persistent infections, but not all of them, form what's called a provirus. This is similar to a prophage. This is kind of like lysogenic cycle where the genome of the virus inserts itself into the host genome. And then periodically through stress, you actually get the formation of new virions, which can slowly release out of the cell over time. A good example of this would be something like HIV. Now, our last type of infection here are latent persistent infections. Um, these have flare-ups with dormancy periods. And so during the flare-up, you get the same viral shedding like you had with the chronic persistent infections. And that's when the person's experiencing their symptoms. These can also oftentimes be triggered by stress, even more so than your chronic persistent infections. Oftentimes, the chronic infections will just kind of slowly ramp up the infection level without the need for stress. But in these latent persistent infections, they are oftentimes very much driven by stressors like fever or sunburn or changes in hormones. So a big example of this would be something like the herpes viruses. So this would include things like HSV1, 2, and 3. And so HSV1 is your cold sores. HSV2 is going to be like genital herpes. And then 3 is going to be your like chickenpox and shingles. And now that we have a vaccine for shingles, it's some of you, or for chickenpox, some of you may have never actually experienced this. However, with each of these, um, you can have symptoms and they usually arise under stressful conditions. And then like when your body kind of returns to homeostasis, then the virus goes back into its prophage form or provirus form. Many of these persistent infections can lead to cancer. They are called oncoviruses. About 10 to 15% of all cancers are caused by oncoviruses. And they basically just stimulate this uncontrolled host cell division, and they decrease the host ability to detect when they need to stop dividing. And so this is stuff like HPV, human papillomavirus, and HTLV, human T lymphotropic viruses. And here are a bunch of different examples of some of the viruses that can lead to lead to these different cancers. And I don't need you to necessarily remember all of these, although I think some of them might be useful for you to be aware of. The important part is to kind of think about how this happens through this process of um, basically shutting down the ability to control cell division, which is what cancer is. And so we've got our HPV and some of the herpes viruses, like Kaposi sarcoma is what it causes. Then you got Epstein-Barr virus, HTLV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. So again, I don't want you to memorize all of those particularly. It might be useful to know things like, oh yeah, so hepatitis affects the liver, and so hepatitis B can cause liver cancers, stuff like that. All right, so with that, you should now be able to identify the key mechanisms by which viruses cause chronic and latent persistent infections, as well as explaining what makes a virus oncogenic. And, the second half of that, naming the different viruses and the cancers they cause, is something that I'm less interested in you specifically knowing. All right, well, with that, I will see you soon. Bye bye.